Okay, I want, before I turn to the audience, I want to say a few words on my own after listening carefully to the two lectures. First, I want to start with two apologies, one to Jibril and one to Gilead. To Jibril, I'm really deeply sorry that I missed the sports part of your biography, and I'm particularly ashamed of it because I myself very close to sports in general and to soccer in particular. And during my youth, as a young lecturer at this university, I was even part of Tel Aviv University's soccer team. And we had some very good players. Some of them later on played in the professional football, like Yora Spiegel and those of you who knows and others. Of course, I was lagging far behind those guys. Now, my second and more serious, perhaps, apologies to Gilead, because in my hastiness to invite him to the podium, I missed some important notes about his own biography. So I really, for those of you who don't know him, because we all assume that everyone knows Gilad was a former head bureau and policy coordinator of Israel's Prime Minister and Minister of Defense Ehud Barak, co-chief negotiator in 1999-2001 at the Camp David Summit and the Taba Talks, about which he published highly recommended books, and our students, I think, have to read it. He served under the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin as delegate to the 1994-1995 interim agreement negotiations. He is, in private life, a senior partner in Gilad Sher company law officers, and he practices areas, his practice areas are corporate law, project transactions, constitutional law, and dispute resolutions. Apropos dispute resolution, is also a teacher, lecturer, and one of the most veteran lecturer in our program, in our both programs, the Evans program in conflict resolution, which is conducted in Hebrew, and the international program, which is in conflict resolution and mediation, which is conducted in Hebrew. In addition, he is a visiting professor at the famous Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. And as I mentioned, I thought he was brigadier general in the reserve. I was told in his modest way that he was just a colonel in the reserve. So sorry for this mistake. Now, with these two apologies, I want to say a couple of comments that are directed, in fact, to both of you. I think that, and particularly taking your last words, Gilad, about the solution, etc., etc. To me, the situation here, if I would like to borrow a paradigm or an example from game theory, and some of you have learned game theory, one of the closest examples is really prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma is a situation where two sides compete with each other, and certainly there is some sort of competition between the Israeli and Palestinians. Each of them can try to beat the other or to cooperate. And as those that are familiar with this sort of situation, in various experiments, real life and laboratory experiments, there is no doubt that the only way that both sides are going to win, namely what we call a win-win situation, is they cooperate. And unfortunately, this is a kind of a rational perspective on the conflict. And I'm sure that the leaders of both sides are rational enough to understand it. So why don't they cooperate? And here is one of the empirical findings of prisoner dilemma, and I myself conducted a series of experiments on this while a student in Ann Arbor, Michigan, is the question of trust. They simply don't trust each other. And since they don't trust, each is trying to salvage from the situation when he sees an opportunity, or he believes that he has an opportunity, and then he tried to beat the other, and the result is that both are losing. And I really think that one of the obstacles, the most serious obstacles, not the only one, because there are, let's face it, there are on both sides, on the Israeli extreme or radical right and the Palestinian radical militant, there are factions that actually would like to simply to solve the problem by annihilation one of the other. And we have on the Jewish sides, we have, as I said, the radical right, both the religious and secular right. And on the Palestinians, you know who they are, whether it's the Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. But the majority, and this is the good side, the majority on both sides, when he asked the question in so many times, prefers a two-state solution that all of us believe. So why don't we reach it? And I think that there are two major factors. One that I mentioned is trust, lack of trust of it. Second, there are misperceptions. And I would like to end my comment by giving you a fresh example from the Peace Index survey that I'm conducting every month. And these results, I just got them today. Okay, no, I have them here. We asked the Israeli, and I'm paraphrasing, not the exact formulation, if the choice is between Israel staying and remaining a Jewish democratic state with a Jewish majority, or against continued control or occupation of the West Bank. And of course, the Gaza Strip is no longer relevant. A large majority, a vast majority of over 75% of the Israeli prefer a Jewish democratic state abdicating control of the West Bank. Which is, but here is, this was the good news. What is the bad news? The bad, and it has to do with what I said in addition to trust, misperception or perhaps wishful thinking. A majority of the Israeli, and I'm talking about Israeli Jews only, a majority of Israeli, about 55% or so, believe that Israel can remain democratic even if it controls the West Bank, and they refuse to accept the idea that a continued occupation will eventually lead to a joint Palestinian-Israeli entity or a state in which Israel will lose, the Jewish majority will be lost, which means that actually there is a misperception of the Israeli. One way to phrase it is to have the cake and to eat the cake and keep it. And I think that one of the what I would say the lessons that I draw from such a finding is that the task of, in this case, is the Jewish political leadership is to convince and to explain, first of all, perhaps to themselves, but most important to the larger Israeli public, that Israel cannot remain a Jewish state and a democratic state if it continues occupation. And if, as I've just shown, most of the Israeli Jews do not want occupation if it means a cancellation of Israel as a Jewish state, then the logical conclusion is quite clear. But as I said, rationality, logic is not only the factor, the only factor that plays in this game. Now, with regard to the Palestinian, there is also some misunderstanding, which is similar to the ignorance or perhaps lack of empathy on behalf of the Israelis. For example, you mentioned you must deliver to your own people that for the Israeli, the maintaining in the literal sense, the principle of the right of return, which means that Palestinians and their descendants from all over will have the right to come and settle in Israel, and this is the state of Israel, not in Palestine, but in Israel, and some even go on in details and say not only to the state of Israel, but to the cities and villages in which they used to live. Right or wrong, it is totally unacceptable to the Israeli, because it means that if Israel accepts it, it's like actually committing, from their point of view, suicide. So I think that there is misperceptions, and I think that the Palestinian leadership, by keeping on and inflaming this principle, not only create illusions among their own people, but it also delusions the Israeli from the hope that the Palestinians really want peace, which brings me back to the issue of trust. So I think that we have to deal here not only with the question of rational choice, but with psychological or social psychological factors that must be taken into account if we want to advance the idea that all three of us at least share, namely the creation of two viable independent states, a Palestinian state and an Israeli Jewish state. Thank you.